Imagine discovering that the God you thought was always singular and eternal once shared the stage with other powerful deities. Hidden beneath the layers of Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy lies a forgotten world where Yahweh, El, Baal, and Asherah all shape the destiny of Israel. Archaeology whispers secrets long erased by reform and exile, revealing inscriptions from Bethel to Ugaritic texts that challenge the polished version of monotheism we know today. What if the divine council was once real, and Yahweh's rise was not purely spiritual, but also deeply political? This is not just history. It's a revelation that shakes faith, tradition, and identity. To understand how monotheism triumphed, we must revisit the gods erased, the battles rewritten, and the truths hidden in plain sight. The question is, are you ready to see what was never meant to be seen? Imagine for a moment that Yahweh did not begin as the central God of Israel, but as a desert deity, worshipped by nomadic tribes wandering through harsh landscapes. Ancient Egyptian records from the 13th century BCE describe the Shasu people bowing to Yahweh in the arid lands of Seir, Edom, and Teman. He was not yet the God of Genesis or Exodus, but rather a fierce protector of small clans who lived under constant threat. It was a raw, warrior-like figure, closer to survival than theology. Think of it as the earliest spark of a fire that later would light up all of Israel. Over time, Yahweh started absorbing roles and titles that once belonged to El, the Canaanite high god known as El Elyon, the Most High. In places like Bethel, meaning House of El, and even in the very name Israel, meaning El rules, the mark of El was still strong. Yet Yahweh, through cultural fusion and theological editing, began to wear these titles like a new garment. He was no longer just a tribal deity of the Shasu, but gradually embraced as El Shaddai, the Eternal One who blessed, protected, and reigned. This transformation wasn't abrupt. It was slow, subtle, and deeply intentional. This shift also reveals something fascinating about how ideas evolve. Humans adapt their beliefs to match their needs. Just as Yahweh was reshaped to hold the authority once given to El, people today reshape traditions to survive in a modern world. For example, when someone rebrands their small business to reflect trust and authority, they echo what Israel did by rebranding their God with titles from El. And just as that gave Yahweh more influence, such changes today can give a person's vision more power. But this is only the beginning, because once Yahweh took El's place, something much bigger started unfolding. Archaeology provides intriguing support for this evolution. Inscriptions from Ugaritic texts still honor El as leader of the divine council, while Israelite writings increasingly highlight Yahweh. This overlap shows us that it wasn't about one God suddenly vanishing, but about one identity merging into another. Think of it like language. Words disappear not because they're erased, but because new expressions take over. Yahweh became the dominant word, while El faded into the background, yet never entirely disappeared. Even centuries later, echoes of El still whisper through Scripture, and here's where the story gains momentum. As Yahweh was reshaped into El's likeness, he began to stand above other deities in the Canaanite world. The people no longer looked only to a tribal warrior, but to a God capable of carrying titles like El Elyon and El Shaddai. This elevated Yahweh from a desert figure into the architect of creation itself, the one who could command a nation. Yet as powerful as this was, the transformation was far from over, because once Yahweh gained El's titles, the next step was to fuse their very identities. At first, Yahweh's worship looked very different from the refined monotheism later celebrated in Deuteronomy. He was honored with rituals tied to survival, sacrifices for protection, vows before battles, prayers for rain in deserts. His earliest followers did not see him as the sole god of the cosmos, but as a patron who fought for their survival. In that sense, Yahweh's origin feels human. He grew out of the real needs of real people facing daily threats. He was intimate, local, and fierce, not yet the universal creator of Genesis. Over centuries, Israel began weaving Yahweh into older traditions surrounding El. Where once El had ruled the divine council, now Yahweh appeared as the one standing above all. Imagine rewriting a family story. The elder who once led is gently replaced by the younger son, whose name now appears in all the records. It's subtle but powerful. The scriptures, especially Exodus, carefully crafted this new identity, making Yahweh appear as the eternal God who had always been there. This was more than theology, it was narrative engineering. A striking detail comes in Exodus 6:3, where God tells Moses, "I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh I was not known to them." This verse reveals the editorial fusion. A clear distinction between El and Yahweh is acknowledged, yet collapsed into one identity. It's almost like a company rebranding, keeping the legacy but insisting it was always the same entity. For Israel, this gave Yahweh historical depth and ancient authority, tying him back to Genesis. For us, it shows how faith adapts its stories to unify identity. The rise of Yahweh also demonstrates how power is consolidated through reform. Just as King Josiah would later purify worship in Jerusalem, earlier priests and scribes were already shaping Yahweh's image. They merged old names and erased competing ones, giving the people a single figure to rally behind. In communication today, we see the same principle. Leaders simplify symbols to unite followers. Think of modern logos, simple, recognizable, yet loaded with meaning. Yahweh's rise was ancient branding at its finest, and so Yahweh grew from a desert deity into the eternal God of Israel, slowly merging with El. But merging names was not enough. The old world of the divine council, where many gods ruled, still echoed in texts like Deuteronomy 32:8. To fully establish Yahweh as supreme, the next step was more daring, fusing him into El while silencing the plurality of divine voices. That step marks the next great turning point. Deuteronomy 32:8, especially in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Septuagint versions, gives us a glimpse into the older worldview. It describes El dividing the nations among the sons of God, assigning Yahweh the nation of Israel. Here, Yahweh is not yet supreme over all, but rather a national protector within a divine council led by El. Imagine it like a king distributing territories among his princes. Yahweh's role was powerful, but not unique. This small detail cracks open a window into how identities were reshaped. Over time, scribes and theologians adjusted the wording. What was once sons of God became sons of Israel, effectively erasing the council and making Yahweh's role appear more absolute. It was as if a corporate document was rewritten to show that the boss had always been the sole decision-maker. By the time of later biblical editions, Yahweh was not just one deity among many. He was the only name on the throne. This was a quiet revolution, hidden in the text itself. The transformation reflects something universal. Humans simplify complexity to create stability. Just as people today collapse complicated histories into simple slogans, Israel condensed divine plurality into the single figure of Yahweh. For example, think about how modern nations rally around one flag, even though their histories are woven from many tribes and voices. The shift from El's council to Yahweh's sole reign echoes that same desire for unity. It turned multiplicity into clarity. Archaeology from Ugaritic sources further highlights this transition. Ugaritic texts describe El presiding over a council of 70 divine sons, echoing the same worldview behind early Israelite belief. Yet later editors of Genesis and Deuteronomy erased those plural voices, ensuring only Yahweh remained. It was not destruction, but absorption. The divine council lived on, but under one name. Yahweh became the mask that carried all their power. And with that fusion, Yahweh gained the attributes of El, but also the authority to claim what was once divided. Israel no longer saw itself as one tribe under a patron, but as the chosen people of the eternal ruler. This shift set the stage for conflicts with other gods, because if Yahweh now carried El's authority, he had to also overshadow rivals like Baal. That confrontation would reshape the mythology entirely. The genius of the scribes lies in how they made Yahweh appear timeless. By blending him with El, they presented the illusion that Yahweh had always been the eternal God. It's like editing an old photograph to place a modern leader in the background, making him appear present at every historic moment. Genesis and Exodus were not just sacred texts, they were strategic rewritings that redefined history itself. In this way, Yahweh's rise was inseparable from the art of storytelling. A good example comes from the phrase El Elyon, the Most High. Originally tied to El, it gradually became synonymous with Yahweh in Israelite texts. Psalms, for instance, celebrate Yahweh with titles once reserved for El, smoothing the transition. Imagine borrowing someone else's medals to wear them on your own chest. Eventually, people forget who earned them first. This borrowing was not theft, but reinvention, and it gave Yahweh cosmic legitimacy. The same happened with El Shaddai, once a separate identity, later absorbed into Yahweh's character. Exodus 6:3 openly highlights this fusion, acknowledging El Shaddai as a past revelation, but insisting Yahweh was the fuller truth. For believers, this created a seamless story of continuity. For historians, it reveals the fingerprints of theological reform. It's a reminder that even divine names carry the weight of politics and cultural change. Today, we might see similar patterns in how ideologies or even brands evolve. A small company merges with a giant, keeping the old name for a while before it's fully absorbed. Think of how Instagram became part of Facebook's empire, now Meta, yet still carries its own identity in people's minds. Yahweh's fusion with El worked the same way. Continuity first, full replacement later. This ensured both loyalty and authority. But once Yahweh's identity absorbed El, a new rivalry came to the forefront. Baal, the storm god, still dominated popular devotion across Canaan. To establish Yahweh as unrivaled, scribes needed to rewrite myths, stripping Baal of his power and recasting him as an enemy. What followed was not just a battle of gods, but a rewriting of cosmic roles, thunder and lightning included. Baal was no minor rival. In the Canaanite world, he was the storm god, master of rain, thunder, and fertility. Farmers looked to him for crops, kings for victory, and villages for survival. His imagery of riding on the clouds shaped the imagination of the people. To replace him, Yahweh had to take over his very attributes. This meant rewriting myths so the people would see Yahweh, not Baal, as the one who commanded the skies. One of the clearest examples is Psalm 29, which many scholars suggest was originally a hymn to Baal. The language of storms, crashing waves, and divine thunder fits Baal perfectly. Yet the psalm was reworked to exalt Yahweh, not Baal. Imagine editing a popular song and replacing the artist's name with your own. It's bold, but it works if the tune is familiar. The people heard their favorite hymn, but now directed their devotion toward Yahweh. Stories like Elijah's confrontation on Mount Carmel, 1 Kings 18, dramatize this rivalry. Baal's prophets call for fire from heaven, but only Yahweh responds, proving his supremacy. The narrative redefines Baal not as a source of power, but as a powerless idol. It's theater with a message. The storm, the lightning, the fire, all belong to Yahweh. In this way, the scriptures rewrote the drama of divine power. What we see here is more than competition. It's psychological strategy. By giving Yahweh Baal's powers, scribes didn't need to erase Baal from memory. They simply made him redundant. People could still imagine the storm god, but now his name was Yahweh. The trick was not to deny the familiar, but to reframe it, much like how new leaders adopt old slogans to win trust. It was a seamless takeover of imagination, and yet Baal's shadow lingered. Popular devotion to him did not vanish overnight, and traces of his worship survived across Israel. That persistence made the reforms even stricter in later centuries, pushing harder to cut Baal away from Israel's story. But as we'll see, Baal wasn't the only figure who had to be erased. Asherah, the ancient goddess, also stood in Yahweh's path. To understand the depth of Baal's influence, one must look to the Ugaritic texts, where he appears as the champion who defeats the chaotic sea. These myths deeply shaped Canaanite culture, making Baal central to their worldview. But when Israelite scribes adopted the same imagery for Yahweh, they shifted the narrative. Suddenly, it was Yahweh who conquered the waters, subdued chaos, and sat enthroned above the floods. Baal's myth lived on, only under a new name. The Book of Job even mirrors Baal's battle themes, with Yahweh defeating Leviathan, the sea monster. This is not coincidence. It is borrowed myth rebranded. Such absorption shows how flexible theology can be when political and cultural needs demand it. It's like rewriting folklore. The hero's name changes, but the story remains familiar enough for people to follow. That familiarity anchored devotion while redirecting loyalty. The rivalry with Baal also shaped ritual reforms. Altars once raised to Baal were rededicated to Yahweh, often in the very same locations. Sacred spaces were repurposed, not abandoned, allowing continuity for the worshippers. Imagine converting an old theater into a church. The building remains, but its purpose shifts. This pragmatic approach ensured the transition was effective and long-lasting. Theologically, this absorption strengthened Yahweh's image as cosmic ruler. By claiming the thunder, lightning, and seas, Yahweh was no longer only tied to Israel but linked to universal forces. Baal's attributes expanded Yahweh's domain beyond desert and tribe, making him the god of storms and nations. This was a crucial step toward universalizing his worship, but the true test came with the goddess Asherah. If Baal was competition in the skies, Asherah was competition in the home, tied to fertility, family, and household devotion. Her presence was deeply rooted, even associated with Yahweh himself in inscriptions. To create a truly monotheistic identity, this bond had to be rewritten, and that is where the reforms of King Josiah left their strongest mark. Archaeological discoveries, especially the inscriptions at Kuntilet Ajrud, reveal something startling. Yahweh was once paired with Asherah. These texts speak of Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting she was seen as his consort, just as she had been El's partner in Canaanite religion. This detail disrupts the neat image of monotheism we are used to. In reality, Yahweh's story was shaped by relationships with other deities before reforms erased them. Asherah was no minor figure. She was the goddess of fertility, motherhood, and protection, tied to sacred trees and household shrines. For families in Israel, her symbols brought comfort in daily life. People carved her image, placed it in their homes, and prayed for children, safety, and prosperity. She was the goddess of intimacy, not empire. And because of this, her presence was stubbornly hard to erase. The reforms of King Josiah in the 7th century BCE targeted her worship directly. Altars were torn down, sacred poles destroyed, and references to Asherah systematically removed from official religion. This was not just theology but politics, centralizing all devotion in Jerusalem's temple. Imagine a government banning local traditions to enforce a single national identity. It's disruptive, but it creates unity. That was the goal of Josiah's reform, yet traces of Asherah lingered in the people's memory. Even after the destruction of her symbols, archaeology shows small figurines continued to appear in homes. It's a reminder that people's private devotion often resists official law. Just as families today may keep personal rituals despite national religion, Israelites quietly honored Asherah while outwardly obeying temple reforms. Faith cannot be erased by decree alone, but Asherah's removal cleared the way for Yahweh to stand alone as Israel's God. Once his consort was erased from the narrative, Yahweh could be presented as a solitary figure without divine family ties. This shift from partnership to singularity was essential for monotheism. Still, the story was not complete. The exile to Babylon would push this transformation even further. The association of Yahweh with Asherah reminds us that monotheism was not born overnight. It was carved piece by piece from older traditions. Think of it as sculpting. The artist chips away parts of the stone until a new form appears. Early Israelite religion was full of divine partners and rivals, and Asherah was central among them. Removing her was a deliberate act, not a natural evolution. In fact, the removal of Asherah shows the tension between official religion and popular practice. Kings and priests could issue reforms, but the people lived religion in their kitchens and bedrooms. Household idols and fertility rituals persisted long after Josiah's reforms. Archaeology gives us a voice for the ordinary people who resisted silent erasure. Their figurines tell us they were not ready to abandon the goddess so easily. Theological texts also hint at her shadow. Some scholars see echoes of Asherah in references to wisdom in Proverbs, or in the feminine imagery used for God in later writings. While not explicit, these subtle traces suggest that her influence was never entirely lost. It slipped beneath the surface like roots under the soil, feeding the cultural memory. But for the priests and editors shaping the Bible, such ambiguity could not stand. Yahweh's uniqueness depended on eliminating divine partners. So, Asherah was recast as an idol, stripped of dignity, and erased from the official narrative. What had been sacred poles and shrines became symbols of rebellion against true faith. The memory of Asherah was not just removed, it was demonized. Yet even in her erasure, Asherah shaped Yahweh's final image. By stripping away his consort, scribes redefined him as the solitary ruler of heaven and earth. This prepared the ground for a deeper shift, turning Yahweh from a national god into the cosmic, universal judge. That transformation would unfold during Israel's darkest moment, the Babylonian exile. The association of Yahweh with Asherah reminds us that monotheism was not born overnight. It was carved piece by piece from older traditions. Think of it as sculpting. The artist chips away parts of the stone until a new form appears. Early Israelite religion was full of divine partners and rivals, and Asherah was central among them. Removing her was a deliberate act, not a natural evolution. In fact, the removal of Asherah shows the tension between official religion and popular practice. Kings and priests could issue reforms, but the people lived religion in their kitchens and bedrooms. Household idols and fertility rituals persisted long after Josiah's reforms. Archaeology gives us a voice for the ordinary people who resisted silent erasure. Their figurines tell us they were not ready to abandon the goddess so easily. Theological texts also hint at her shadow. Some scholars see echoes of Asherah in references to wisdom in Proverbs, or in the feminine imagery used for God in later writings. While not explicit, these subtle traces suggest that her influence was never entirely lost. It slipped beneath the surface, like roots under the soil, feeding the cultural memory. But for the priests and editors shaping the Bible, such ambiguity could not stand. Yahweh's uniqueness depended on eliminating divine partners. So Asherah was recast as an idol, stripped of dignity and erased from the official narrative. What had been sacred poles and shrines became symbols of rebellion against true faith. The memory of Asherah was not just removed, it was demonized. Yet even in her erasure, Asherah shaped Yahweh's final image. By stripping away his consort, scribes redefined him as the solitary ruler of heaven and earth. This prepared the ground for a deeper shift, turning Yahweh from a national god into the cosmic universal judge. That transformation would unfold during Israel's darkest moment, the Babylonian exile. The exile of 586 BCE shattered Israel's world. Jerusalem burned, the temple was destroyed, and the people were dragged to Babylon. It was a crisis that demanded new answers. How could Yahweh, once seen as protector of Israel, allow such defeat? The response was revolutionary. Yahweh was reimagined as more than a national god. He became the universal ruler, sovereign over even Babylon itself. This shift is visible in the prophets. Isaiah declares Yahweh as the one who created the heavens, shaped the earth, and commands all nations. No longer is he tied only to Israel's borders, he is cosmic judge. It was a bold reinterpretation born from trauma. When survival was at stake, theology expanded. Yahweh was no longer just defender of a tribe, but Lord of history. Editors during the exile revisited older texts, reshaping them for this new vision. References to the divine council were erased and plural voices silenced. Where Genesis once spoke of, "Let us make man in our image," later interpretations insisted this was poetic, not literal plurality. Monotheism crystallized under the pressure of exile, polished by editorial hands. This process mirrors how people today respond to crisis. When faced with loss, many reframe their worldview to make sense of suffering. Israel did the same. By elevating Yahweh above Babylon, they turned defeat into proof of divine sovereignty. The exile did not end faith, it redefined it. The trauma became theology. But the consolidation was not only spiritual, it was political. By shaping Yahweh as the one God, leaders unified a scattered people under a single identity. This was survival through faith, a powerful model of resilience. Yet questions remained. If Yahweh absorbed El, Baal, and Asherah, where do we find the evidence of this transformation today? Archaeology holds some of the answers. One of the clearest examples of this monotheising process is the book of Deuteronomy. Its repeated calls to worship Yahweh alone echo the reforming spirit of the exile. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one. This was not just prayer, it was identity in crisis. The words were a banner uniting a broken nation. The exile sharpened distinctions. What had once been tolerated, shrines, symbols, local gods, was now rejected. The destruction of Jerusalem was interpreted as punishment for divided worship. The solution? Exclusive devotion to Yahweh. Monotheism became not just theology, but survival strategy. Prophetic literature reinforced this. Jeremiah condemned idols, Ezekiel envisioned Yahweh's glory returning to a restored temple, and 2nd Isaiah proclaimed Yahweh as creator of all. These texts were crafted to heal a wounded people by giving them a bigger God. No longer local, no longer partnered, Yahweh was supreme over the universe. Yet even here, hints of older beliefs remain. The divine council imagery still echoes faintly in Genesis and Psalms, though reinterpreted. Archaeologists and textual scholars can trace these threads, showing how pluralism was rewritten into singularity. It's like editing a story where multiple heroes become one. If you look closely, you still see the seams, and these seams are vital. They remind us that faith is not static but dynamic, shaped by crisis and reform. Israel's exile turned a warrior god into the universal judge, a shift that echoes through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam today. But to confirm this journey, we must look beyond texts, to names, inscriptions, and artifacts that reveal El's shadow in Yahweh's rise. Archaeology offers powerful clues about this transformation. Names like Israel and Bethel preserve the memory of El, even as Yahweh became central. Inscriptions at Kuntalet, Ajrud link Yahweh to Asherah, while others invoke El Shaddai. These fragments are like puzzle pieces, showing a past where multiple divine figures coexisted. The Bible tells one story, but artifacts tell another. Exodus 6:3 is another revealing piece. It acknowledges that the patriarchs knew God as El Shaddai, but not as Yahweh. This distinction shows that the identities were separate before being fused. Later readings blurred the line, insisting Yahweh was always the one. It's as if history itself was rewritten to hide the seams. Ugaritic texts provide even broader context. They describe El as chief of the divine council and Baal as lord of storms. These parallels reveal how Israelite religion was shaped by its Canaanite environment. Yahweh did not emerge in isolation, but grew by absorbing and reshaping the roles of El, Baal, and Asherah. The archaeology of language itself preserves these connections. Think of it like cultural borrowing today. Just as music blends styles, hip-hop sampling jazz or rock borrowing blues, ancient Israel blended myths and names. Yahweh's final image was not pure invention, but a remix of Canaanite traditions. Archaeology helps us hear the original tracks beneath the remix. These discoveries challenge the neat story of monotheism's birth. They show that what became faith was once negotiation, absorption, and reform. By tracing these echoes, we see not only the rise of Yahweh, but the forgotten gods left behind. And this leads us to the larger conclusion. Monotheism was less revelation and more revolution. Consider how names preserve memory. Israel, Bethel, and even personal names like Samuel or Elijah contain El, not Yahweh. This linguistic residue tells us El's supremacy lingered in culture even after Yahweh's rise. People may change stories, but names hold on to the past. It's like calling your city by an old nickname. The legacy remains, even if the meaning changes. Archaeologists also uncover figurines, altars, and inscriptions that show the coexistence of Yahweh with Asherah. These artifacts disrupt the idea of a pure monotheism from the start. Instead, they show a religion in motion, wrestling with old gods while elevating a new one. The physical evidence refuses to be silenced. Biblical texts themselves hold contradictions. Passages distinguish El from Yahweh, then merge them, showing the editorial hand at work. The seams are visible to those who look carefully. Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy are not single voices, but layered edits, stitched together to present unity. Behind the unity, plurality still echoes. What's remarkable is how this fusion created continuity. By absorbing El's attributes, Yahweh appeared ancient, timeless, and universal. By adopting Baal's powers, he became storm god and warrior. By erasing Asherah, he stood alone as cosmic judge. Archaeology and texts show how each piece was absorbed until one god remained. And so the story closes. Monotheism was not born in a single moment, but shaped across centuries of reform, exile, and rewriting. King Josiah's decrees, Babylonian trauma, and scribal edits all forged Yahweh's final identity. Yet beneath that polished figure, the shadows of El, Baal, and Asherah still linger. The forgotten gods whisper through the cracks of history,